There we go, that's a bit better. It's nice when things work, isn't it? Righty-ho. So, I had to just very quickly restart the stream then, just because my audio wasn't coming through for some reason when I was checking it behind the scenes. But now it is. Way. So yeah. A couple of reasons why I'm doing things on another separate channel. First off, when I was using my Chris Plays one, my work got all pissy with me because it was using the same Twitch stuff, and also using the same Twitter with stuff I sometimes, very sometimes, use for work. So, we scrapped that, made all this nice shiny new. And yeah, I'm going to be using this if I'm just going to be doing bits and pieces if they're essentially not going to be guildy stuff with the Knights of the Round Table guys. So yeah, stick around. It's probably going to be absolute chaos. But yeah, the idea is just to try and show a couple of things today. Telling you, man, it's nice when it all works. Righty. So, the idea here is I'm going to start simply and go on from there. So, some of the stuff, if you've actually been playing a bit of Landmark, some of this might seem really, really simple when I start off. But, who knows? It might surprise some of you. So let us begin. So, the first thing that a lot of people tend to like to do, and this is, it's almost a personal preference thing, but it's how voxels look if you manipulate them in a particular way. And this is very much how a lot of people have started to do railings and bits and pieces on staircases and all the rest of it to try and make it look a little bit fancier. Versus just essentially just doing bog standard voxels like this. Now, normally speaking, if you have just like bog standard voxels and you apply whatever texture to it, it'll just come out more or less looking like this. It's not that great. It'll do if you don't want to spend a couple of minutes just adjusting things. However, what you want to do, you want to take your railing, just select the entire thing. You then want to copy it out 3 times, so you've got this sort of looking thing here. select the whole thing. And then you want to smooth it just a few times. You don't want to get too overboard with it. Just enough so you can kind of see it starting to curve the edges. You can kind of go as far as you want with it really, but... yeah, usually hitting smooth 2 or 3 times will do the job. So you can kind of see there's this bit here. What you want to then do, ignoring the very edges, you just want to basically take a middle slice of it. So this sort of length here. And what it actually does is it reshapes a lot of the texture, so you'll get like warping effects and stuff on the texture, so it adds a little bit more detail to it. Some people, when you're going from one to the other, some people like to smooth it down loads more than what that is. So it's like a lot of the time they think it's a little bit too plain, if that makes sense. If that's the case, smooth it right the way down until you can see the edges starting to distort. Then effectively do the same again, so you want to take the middle section, you don't want to take the edges of what you're doing. And you'll end up with this. Now, this is one of the things that a lot of people tend to use a lot more for using it for railings and things, mainly because it looks more the sort of size of a plank rather than it being the full sort of voxel size. So a lot of it just depends on how much you want to smooth that section that you've made. And yeah, you know, it all comes down to personal preference on things like that. You'll find on most of my builds I tend to prefer it when it's this sort of size. So much to the point of where I do actually have one pre-templated. So yeah, it all just comes down to personal preference of what sort of shape you want. I mean, some people prefer it when it's a lot more flatter like this. I tend to prefer it where it's a little bit more square. But yeah, it's very much personal preference, but it does come out looking a lot nicer compared to just your bog standard layout. The other part of this is essentially the first sort of style where you start messing with microvoxels. Or at least it's a similar sort of thing as what people were starting to develop. So, if you have your bog standard rail post, again, it's just a square set of voxels, dead boring. Now, you can do a couple of things with this. You can either just outright smooth the shape out, so you just have just a slim post. Now, what happens with this when you place them onto a floor, it will, by default anyway, it will try and warp the floor shape. As soon as you reapply the floor back to it, you'll start to get this sort of arced edge. So like you can kind of see here where like the voxels are kind of pulled down evenly. So a lot of people tend to like that as making it look more like an anchored edge, if that makes sense. And when you place your railing that you've made on top of it, it does exactly the same thing on the top as well. So that's how a lot of people just tend to make the slightly different shapes on the posts. It's something that's relatively quick to do. It's not all that taxing technically wise, because a lot of the shape is actually being done by the game itself, so you don't have to like sit there and fiddle with it so much. You can just kind of place things down, the game will do all the hard work for you. But from essentially going from a dead bog standing railing, you've now got a bit of shape. It looks more like a railing as well. And let's say you're not really limited by these sort of layouts as well. You can just like mess around with the textures and stuff to get it how you want. What a lot of people start doing with this, if you want to start messing with the shapes of the railings, you do have to start being a little bit careful. And I'll show you what I mean by that. So yeah, I want to use something that's really obvious. Actually, I can use this because it's white, it'll stand out. As soon as you reapply a full-size voxel to something, if it's been a shape that's been created, so like these shapes just underneath, so these shapes on these two that are still here, they were created just purely by this being applied on top, but then also this part being thin as well, so it kind of merges the two together. But as soon as you apply a full-size normal voxel to it, you can kind of see there it just squares things right back out. Which some people use quite a lot, so it's like if you want like, if this was a taller shape, you could basically duplicate what's happened down here below, where it's like you could then have a fancier middle shape and then another thinner connection on top. However, the one thing you're never limited to with voxels is that whichever order you add things in, the game will always try and snap things back to it. So I basically completely smoothed out my little white voxel into this really thin line here. It still kept the angled shape at the top, but because it's having to go down into this really fine point, it's changed the shape compared to what these are. And you can kind of see as well, because there was another voxel here, if I wanted it to be in line, I would basically have to smooth that down to match, you see. So you can basically just start messing around with the shapes of these quite easily. There's not too much involved in it as such. Generally speaking though, the more complicated you want to actually make the shape, the more technical it will start to get. Which I will come back to because I want to actually go from this into something else. Which is one of the things that one of the things I've seen a lot of people bitching about is they want the option to make basically cylinder shapes in the game, so very similar to how we have these shapes here. So you've got spheres, cubes, you've got slopes, like angled slopes pre-done in the game. They want to have the option to effectively make a predetermined cylinder size. Just bear with me, I'm just clearing up a bit of space. Not that I need it, mind, I've got loads of stuff, but I've got this entire area to work with, but nah. So, one of the things that a lot of people have trouble with when they're designing circular shapes in the game is that they say it doesn't look smooth enough because the smooth tool's different, blah de blah de blah, complaints. Fundamentally though, the way to actually create the cylinders is still exactly the same. The tutorial video that I actually made way back in alpha, I say way back in alpha, it was a couple of months back now, it still fundamentally works the same way. The only difference as such is that it's one, how you select things that's a little bit different, and two, how you use the smoothing tool. That's the key differences. Just gonna show something actually. Where are we? Here we go. People seen these things before? What they class as basically pixel shape generators. I'll leave that up on the screen just so it makes a little bit more sense. Just so you can kind of see what I'm working off here. What have I got a lot of that I don't need? Yeah, back to wood. All else fails, use wood. Oh, my Twitch string's over there. Hang on. I can't put that there. Anyway. So yeah, basically you just want to replicate that shape initially, because although there's a lot of voxel smoothing and things like that involved in the game, fundamentally the game is still just cubes behind the scene. Okay. Uh-oh. I have invaders! Ha! Oh, I would have done, but he's crashed. That was one of my guild members. So yeah, when you have this shape, just go back in and reapply any of those deleted voxels, because they will come back to haunt you later on. Yeah, my guild member was trying to go to someone else. Haha. He's gonna get really, really pissed as well when he realizes he can't get out of here. So, the main thing you've got to look out for here depending on if this is going to be hollow or solid, like I'm going to be doing a hollow one here, purely by that sort of differentiation determines how many layers of this you're going to stack up. So, the reasoning behind doing this way is if it's hollow, you have to stack more layers up. And the reasoning behind it is that the game needs to have voxels to work off to smooth. And because of the way the current smooth tool works, in fact it's a little bit brutal, if you don't have enough layers, the game will just create distortions and you'll be screwed. So yeah, once you've got this decent sized stack, I mean I've got that duplicated 9 times in total on there. If it's solid, you only need to do around about 5, maybe 6 times, something like that. And hello, Dret Gaming. Good morning. So, the way this technique works now, a little bit easier to select because you don't actually need to use the 1 voxel buffer anymore. However, you do need to try and pay a little bit more attention to what happens with the sides here. Because, as I said, the smoothing tool is a little bit brutal. These are, well, they said the old one is still coming along. Whether it is or not, I don't know. But until then, this is what you have to deal with. You need to essentially watch for the edges. If you go too far, it'll become really obvious. Like, as you can see here, where it's got like the really jaggedy edges, that essentially means you've smoothed too far. So you need to actually go back a couple of steps. So once you've done that, you want to try and get this, basically a slice right from the middle of it. So yeah, you can see with the first step, it's very, very close, but there's still edges to it. So, select the whole thing again. Only want to, when you're hitting the smooth tool this time, you only really want to do it 2, maybe 3 times max. Only because again, if you do it any more, it'll just start to distort, so you don't want to be doing that. Once you're done, take that middle slice, or a middle slice depending on how many times you've stacked it up high. You paste it down, and this is what you end up with. Now, the one thing that you'll find is different, because you've used the new smoothing tool versus the old one, the outer shape will still be pretty damn smooth. There's not going to be a whole lot of difference between the old versions and the new ones. If anyone was quick enough to make templates before the new smoothing tool came in. However, the one thing you can't change no matter what you do, and this is why I've kind of... You'll generally get a slight bulbing around the edges of basically half the side, and you literally can't do anything about that now, because it's just fundamentally how the game smooths out voxels. And yeah, you can kind of see with the shape I have, it's still the original square shape I started with. but obviously it's now got voxel smoothing applied to it. But yeah, that's more or less about as smooth as you can get it, which is fine if you just need a smooth outer edge. If you want a smooth inner edge, there's no real super neat way to do it, because it just doesn't have the very fine smoothness as what you would have had before. Which is a shame. It doesn't, on a practical level, you don't really notice it. Like I say, I mean, you only really notice it because of where I'm standing and how I'm pointing it out. If you stand and look at the edge, you know, you can't see that. You know, that bulb out edge is right here, but you can't see it. All you see is this nice smooth edge. So, yeah, it's kind of one of those. Fundamentally, works the same way. Practically, not so much. Before I clear stuff again, I'll move on to the first lot of what I want to do for the next bit, which is to show a similar thing to this, which is using archers. Again, I try as much as humanly possible when I'm showing a lot of this stuff to not use fancy techniques to get the most basic stuff out to show people. Okie dokie. So the most, if you're playing me, yeah. It's kind of the thing. Oh, hey Jimmy Monica. Monica? That's me saying stuff quickly. Monica. Hello. It's because I said Jiminy too quick. Morning. If you're playing a medieval style, perfect circles aren't a thing. Well, yeah. Have you seen what happens when you actually try and effectively distort these edges? If you try and put in like sort of wear and tear on stuff? The thing that you get relatively quick with these, if you start removing, is you get a lot of this, where it just kind of distorts the top. A lot of people use that if you want to make sort of I won't be doing zero voxels just yet, mainly because I'm showing a couple more basic techniques before going into that. I will show them because when I was doing some of them yesterday for something completely different, people really liked me how I liked me to explain it. So I will be showing zero data voxels at some point. But yeah, so you can kind of see it's like, because of how it's been made, this is the one difference with the new smoothing tool which you wouldn't have had with the old version. Because what would have happened with the old version is these edges would have been completely distorted on these two levels. So you never would have been able to make it nice and neat like this. But because of how the voxel setup works... Ah, my big stone block behind me. No, that's for something else. Yeah, this is just to kind of show something before I start going into things like microvoxels, zero data voxels and all the rest of it. And zero voxel strings and blah de blah de blah. I'm trying to get some of the more basic stuff out to kind of show some of the more basic techniques to improve things. before going into the more technical fiddly stuff. So yeah. So what I'm basically going to be doing on this bit is just showing effectively how to do a very, very simple archway. There's not a whole lot to it. You basically have this massive cube. You get your sphere delete tool, which you can get in a couple of different ways. If I go back a step. Depending on how comfortable you are with keyboard commands. As I mean, I tend to use commands in two different ways. For one, if I'm switching very quickly between my tools, I actually use the hotbar buttons. Some people like to use the command shortcuts and things to doing various bits and pieces. But, yeah, personal preference. When you have a cube selected, so it's like you've got this shape right now, just a box standard cube, you can do one of two things. You can either press C, which will always change the mode of it, so it's like you can see it just jumping between essentially what is the sphere tool and the normal cube. Or if you need to, or if you prefer, and in truth I tend to do this quite a lot, just to make sure I've got the right thing selected, I'll often actually go into my shapes and select it, just so I can actually make sure I've got the right thing selected. But yeah, once you've done that, if you then actually switch the mode of it, so you've gone from the add to the delete, so I just press the number 3 for my hotbar. What you want to do, whenever you're doing a lot of these sort of things, you don't want to use the smallest option. So the thing I've got here, you can sometimes get away with it, so you'll find this little hole that I've made here. One thing you'll find, because it's only using the very, very small sphere delete, you'll get this, where it just doesn't give enough detail for the smoothness, so it's not really ideal. The way that this particular technique works best if you're doing super duper massive archways, you can use this massive delete option, but I tend not to. I tend to use this size. And the way you adjust that is while it's in the scale mode, you just literally just drag with your middle mouse, so just literally scroll up or down to decrease or increase the size of it. So same thing applies, you just basically cut a big hole. You then want to try and take a middle slice, so very similar to what happens when you want to get the best smoothing effect out of the cylinders. Your middle slice will give you the best looking arch. You can tweak it sometimes, but it's not ideal. Other thing you want to make sure of when you're selecting the shape, you need to make sure that your voxel selection goes right the way inside the arch. So you can kind of see that I've got a couple of voxels either side, and then this actually disappears inside as well. You can always tell when it does, because your actual selection tool will change colour slightly as it actually hits and goes inside of existing voxels. As a result, you tend to get this. So it tends to be a much more smoother line, gives you a nicer finish on it. Now, one of the things that people tend to get wrong is actually applying this onto a surface. One thing you need to be sure of when you actually have it interact with standard voxels, you don't want to mess up any part of the archway, otherwise it will just completely distort and you'll end up having to essentially completely redo it. So yeah, that's your basic archway essentially. Now, the reason why I wanted to show that way first was that if you want to make these custom sizes and you want to make them smooth, the best way to do it is essentially doing what I did earlier. Essentially the same thing, you just have a semicircle rather than the full circle, and yeah, it's basically the same technique. So it's like if you're actually using a voxel circle generator, that's essentially all an archway is. Now, where these start to get a little bit more complex when you start doing this, which is when you create your pointed arches. Generally speaking, it's best to start off with when you've got a bog standard shape like this. You don't really want to try and go in and start messing with custom shapes so much. This bit I've done. You can kind of see that block I had was intersecting with the archway here. Now the reason I did it that way, and not everyone does it this way to be honest, but what you'll tend to find is if you again don't have voxels behind it, it will generally distort the join you have here, and you don't really have to keep it there after the fact. You can remove that if you wanted to, or if you were going to create an entire arched underground sort of shape, or just an arched area generally. That would effectively just get removed naturally with how the voxels smooth things out. But it's just to make the join a little bit neater and nicer. The one thing you don't want to do if you're selecting the shape off one of these, you don't want to do this. Basically where I've got this little tiny selection. The reason for that is if you have any point of the arch where there isn't a full voxel behind or above it in one way or the other, it will just distort the shape. So that was kind of why I made sure I've got a voxel up on here, I've got a voxel here off the edge. So if I took that, it would preserve that particular arched shape quite happily. But that's the one thing you do have to make sure of, and it's more in terms of how voxels interact with those. But yeah, it's essentially it's not a too complicated copy and paste job, but you really don't want to start messing around with the voxels where it smooths things, because as soon as you do, it will always distort the shape. Are you cutting out? As in my mic, or as in what I'm building? If it's my mic, it'll probably be I'm using a push to talk rather than a just a pickup on the mic. And the problem of it is, because I'm actually using a gaming keyboard, and I'm actually using a shortcut on the gaming keyboard, for whatever reason it seems to be a little bit temperamental when I'm using XSplit, because it's more or less my way of getting around the fact that XSplit doesn't use mouse buttons for push to talk. So I'm basically using shortcuts on a gaming keyboard to get around it. So yeah, cheating basically. But yeah, it's not ideal, and you know, hell, the one thing I request for XSplit is to have the option to have the mouse buttons as push to talk, because it's what I use everywhere else and it never goes wrong. So, now that I've kind of shown a couple of basic arches and things like that, now we're going to get to the nitty gritty stuff. So you will have to bear with me a minute just while I go through and delete a couple of these spaces up, just so I've got space to work with again. But yeah, that lack of push to talk stuff is the only thing that really annoys me about XSplit. Everything else about it is great. You know what I don't get as well? This is a completely unrelated point because it's about the game. I'm literally in a cave in the middle of nowhere, yet I still get bird sound as background music. But, yeah, I don't know. Ah, that's nice and dark, that'll do me. So, slowly getting a little bit more advanced as we go. Try and show this in proportion. So, the little tiny cube on the left is what they now class as a microvoxel. Oh, I'm not complaining about it, it's just that it's a little bit bizarre. It is one of the things they have said they're going to change and improve as it goes on. Especially because a lot of times with the cave system coming in and stuff pretty soon, they've said they're going to add like different sound effects and things like that to match that sort of thing as well. So if you are building inside the earth, you're going to hear different sounds. So, these little things came about just purely because someone sat there one day and just kept on smoothing a normal size voxel. The way that the standard microvoxel works, which is different to some of the other things I'm going to go through a little bit later, is you can kind of see that what I have selected is still the size of a voxel. It's just that it looks smaller, but it's just that there's space all around it where it's been smoothed out. Now what this allows you to do basically is the easiest way to explain what's happening here as I'm placing this sort of stuff down. The way voxel smoothing generally works in the game is that the game engine itself will always try and associate voxels in a line with each other as they would be if they were normal sized squares. Now, on the bigger scale, that's what allows you to make the smoothed curves. Because the game can see that you've got voxels all kind of neatly around in a curved sort of shape, so it'll smooth all of that out so that it looks like a curve. This is kind of the inverse of that effect. So because you've smoothed it down to below the size of a normal size voxel, as you start stacking them together, it'll keep the size of them all together. Now, what I was doing when it was distorting, out of the way, so you can see there's that little sort of triangular edge. Now, that is purely because it's trying to figure out what should and what shouldn't be within the space of a single voxel. If you get that as you're building, you can always go back in and reapply the voxel to where it's messed up, and it's always at the joint. So as I clicked onto that, it just got rid of that distortion. Some people call it voxel welding, is the term I believe that a lot of people started calling it. But yeah, it's essentially just getting the game to understand what is being associated with each voxel in a line. So it will always try and snap back to that if you just tell it where you want things. However, where you can start to get clever with it and start to mess around with different shapes, different styles and things, is if you make a shape, it doesn't have to be anything fancy. Actually, I will change that slightly. Whenever you're making a shape with the microvoxels, the idea of it is that if you start copying and pasting things, it'll hold the shape. So you can kind of see there was both the middle bit here that I did and this corner, it'll hold that shape together. However, whenever you're applying different styles and things together, if it's got one, basically what they class as like a self-generated angle, so that angle I have in, that angle's only there because the game thinks it's there. The one fault you'll get with microvoxels standardly is if you take that selection and then you try and snap the two together, this happens. So one side of it effectively smooths out because you've basically reapplied the same design back onto itself. So it's essentially smoothed out this one side and left the edge. Now, a lot of people do use that, so for that sort of edge on there, a lot of people use it for making quite nice looking, the word I'm thinking of here, like windowsills and things. Like they use that as like the underside of the windowsill, because you'll basically get like a soft section on here that you can still detail and it doesn't interfere with your wall. But then you've also got an angled underside for the bit outside of where your wall would be. But yeah, you do have to be really careful with what you do with microvoxels, because generally speaking, if you reapply something to a microvoxel at any point, it will automatically try and go back to its most basic shape, which is these very, very smoothed out edges that you start with. But yeah, a lot of people use them for making angles with, so do what you put there, Dret. I think microvoxel welding is when you have a big vox and use microvoxels to get the big vox and play with it. Yeah, it's essentially a similar sort of thing, because you can apply a microvoxel to a normal size voxel and it will snap to that shape. Showing this as a very bad example just to kind of explain what you're putting in on there. The voxel itself will always pull anything around it. So, or at least a normal microvoxel will. I'll go into negative voxels and stuff in a minute because they do interact differently. But you can kind of see both on the bottom side where the floor is and on the voxels just around it. It has kind of pulled in all the voxel around it just to try and... because a normal voxel will still shape to that. And even that sort of thing, of the way that sort of voxel smoothing works, is if you were watching a lot earlier on, that was kind of how I was getting the shapes of the... Now I'm trying to think of what word I'm thinking of again. Yeah, so like the handrails for the actual handrail shapes. They're all these for the post shapes and things that I was doing before. That's all taking into account for that sort of interaction between essentially what is a smaller size voxel and a normal size voxel. But yeah, simple answer is it's because the game can be daft at times. You just kind of have to... The one thing I would generally say about the game is don't necessarily think the game's going to do one thing. I would always say just kind of just have a mess around with it and just see what happens, because the game will work in a uniform manner, because fundamentally behind the scenes it's just all fancy maths at work. However, you do have to be careful with it. This is another thing actually that I would recommend. When you're working with microvoxels, For the love of God, use the translation tools. Don't try and move the camera around. Yeah, like a lot of times, sometimes people prefer to use microvoxels to create sort of angled edges and things. It comes down to personal preference. I mean, at least for certain shapes, I tend not to use microvoxels. Only really because you'll still get a step if you're doing it the way I was doing it then. For angled shapes, it's still generally best to use the line tool. But a lot of people used this for if they needed really, really fine angled shapes that they couldn't get with the line tool. Because again, the limitation of the line tool is that you can't really get it as a single voxel line. It will always it tends to need the bigger size lines to make a smooth shape. But yeah, it comes down to people's personal preference. But yeah, microvoxels do serve a purpose. It just comes down to what you want to make. But yeah, the biggest limitation you'll always get with microvoxels generally is that they'll always pull on the voxels that are around them. So you can kind of see just off the selection I've made of the floor here. You can see just this bit around the edge. It's basically pulled those voxels around where I've got that. Now you can try and get rid of that, but again, because it will still try and make a shape no matter what you do. So as soon as you make the floor flat, with a normal microvoxel it'll go, oh well, you had something there that I need to kind of interact with. So it does that shape. Make sense? So anti-voxels, zero voxels, yeah. Sorry, I'm constantly drinking here. Nothing alcoholic, I'm just really, really thirsty today. Be nice if it was alcoholic, but then again, it's not even midday yet, so that would be surely wrong. So, again, when this next bit I'm going to show first came out, there was, I don't know, there was probably around about 20 odd different names for this when I first saw it coming out. Now, the way the creation works for this particular type of voxel string I'm going to show, when you're making an initial cube shape, because you have to do this to start off with, it has to be a size where there's a single voxel through the middle. Now, the selection tool will always show you this, because it basically, that's more or less what it's there for. So long as you do have that sort of shape, you can basically start this off. I wouldn't necessarily recommend to go anything smaller than 5x5x5. Only because you will get a little bit distortion if you just use basically a 3 voxel cube. Always kind of go 5 voxel or bigger. Lovely dirt. So the idea of this is you want to have that very middle voxel selected. If you're not good at judging things, just always have your selection tool at whatever it is and just count it back, just so that you can make sure that it is the middle that you have selected. Now, when you're smoothing this down, you're going to want to keep an eye on this voxel in the middle, because essentially however small that gets will eventually end up being the size of the voxel string you'll have to work with. So as you can see, teeny tiny hole. Now this is where a lot of the techniques again tend to marry across as you go through the various styles. So when you've smoothed something like that out, if you want to get the best effect of it, take the middle slice. So again, very similar to what you would have if you were making a sphere or an archway or anything like that. The middle always tends to give you the smoothest effect. Now you're going to want to copy this once to create the master, and then you want to copy it again as a separate. You can just about see teeny tiny hole. Oh. Have something really bright and stand out. Although this seems really weird to do so, it doesn't like it because it's raw copper. Hang on. Let's make it a wood. There. Dirt on wood still doesn't really look that neat. It's a little bit nicer on the other side. I think it's because it's a little bit brighter outside by the looks of it. My lights aren't giving me great light inside. 130 little light bulbs. Anyway, once you've filled that voxel in, and you do want to completely fill it in, don't try and just paste the voxel in or anything like that. You want to actually have it selected and then use the add tool to add something inside of it. Doesn't really matter what, but it's just whatever you fill that with is going to be what your string is going to be made out of later. So if you want to have it made out of a certain material, add it with that. I'm just using this so it's a little bit obvious. So what you then do is you take your master slice that you had here, show it from this angle so it's a bit clearer to show that. Basically what you're going to do is you're going to copy and paste the exact shape, one behind like that one is there, and then one in front. Now what this does is, because there was basically two little tiny holes either side of that, very similar to how your normal voxels interact with each other, in that the game tries to always keep things the same when things are in line. What it's done is, the little voxel that you had in the middle there has essentially kind of been stretched with the two small holes either side. What you want to do, you want to make sure you've got that middle voxel selected. What you're left with is this lovely little tiny thing. Now, the reason why these have now become so popular so quickly, and why I've come over here, like I said, normally speaking, if you try and have microvoxels interact, you'll generally get all these distortions, or it'll pull on the ground, like what this one's doing. So you can see the whole shape's being distorted there. However, I'm getting a distortion off another bit over here that I have. Hang on, I will show that on a flat just to kind of make the point. There we go. So yeah, unlike with your standard microvoxel, they class these as negative voxel strings basically, and the reason why you don't get the distortion, it does still happen, but it happens at such a tiny scale that you can't actually see what's happening, because even if I zoom in all the way, you can't really see what's happening here. Is that, at least at the theoretical mathematical stuff going on behind the scenes, there is still technically a tiny hole at the very end of this string on both sides. Now what happens is, where that then interacts with a normal shape, so my floor here, just on that voxel there, rather than distorting up to the shape of this, it just gets pulled in just to where that little tiny hole is. So at a fundamental level, you don't see it on the screen. It's still happening, but because of how you've actually created the string, you'll never see it. So that's fundamentally why these things have become really popular so quickly. And it is just purely because of the fact that you don't get any distortion. Now that being said, some things about them are still similar. So this is your normal microvoxel on this side. This is your negative voxel string. The one thing you don't get the same level of interaction on is effectively the top and bottom sides of the edges. It will still, at a certain level, it will still pull voxels to it. It will do it slightly differently because of how it's made, so you'll actually find that you can kind of see here, it's trying to actually make a curved corner. Because it's just pulling at it smoothly even. Whereas here it's just kind of just sucking everything in. But that's just purely because I've placed it over an existing voxel. So just to kind of show it a little bit neater than what it was on there, it will still pull things towards it. It's just doing it on a slightly different level. So you can kind of get away with using it for certain things differently. This is neat the way you do this, by the way. I'm actually just placing these in a line here, however. The one I'm at. That's what I wanted to show. So the way they all interact together is slightly different too. You do have to be a little bit careful because it is a string and it's not a pure single voxel as such. By themselves, at least, you don't always get the same level of fidelity with them. Ooh, fancy word. All I basically mean by that is that unlike what you can do with the microvoxel welding on this sort of side where you get smooth edges, because it is a string, so it's not, as I say, a single square point or a very small cube as such. Because of that, there's literally no way you can get the same level of interaction just off the string by itself. So even though I've re-welded that a few times, it will still get that distortion unless you start messing around with it. By that, I mean if I do this. So, because I was rotating the string around a slightly different way, it will still try and snap to as smooth a shape as the microvoxel over there. So a lot of people tend to use these for creating slightly different shapes on here. Mainly because unlike with microvoxels, where it will automatically try and give you... Trying to explain the best way here, like rather than it where, like what I was doing with these bits over here, where it will automatically snap to the nearest shape, because of the way the interaction works with them, you can actually start using them to make quite nice little shapes with and stuff, without them sort of getting distortion. So again, a lot of people use them for decorating purposes. And you can keep on going with this. I feel like if I then took this shape, so like a lot of people use them to get like different sorts of angles and shapes and things, essentially based off how they'll interact, because they'll, if you put them too close together, they'll still merge, but so long as you leave enough of a space, it'll do what this one did up on here. So it would just kind of, it'll only pull on part of it, so you can't just start messing around with it really. But yeah, at least on, and again, this is kind of where it will get into people's own personal preference. I personally prefer to use them just for decorating. As a general rule, I tend not to spend too much time messing around with this sort of size voxel. Only because it's, for one, it's fiddly, which will always wind me up. But yeah, if folks have seen a lot of my builds, they tend to be like larger structures and things like that. Because don't get me wrong, I don't mind the level of detail you can get with these. But even Sony themselves have admitted that although it's great the level of detail you can get with this sort of stuff, and they never anticipated you'd get this sort of level of detail. Even they've conceded that when it comes to building all the props, so all these sort of things and essentially anything else, they're still going to be made using what I'd guess you'd class as traditional methods versus doing stuff in game. But yeah, it's very much a personal preference sort of thing really. I mean, what you've put there, Dre, is a very good point. A lot of people actually like to use microvoxels, or essentially using like what they would now class as anti-voxels. Also secretly why I have the space I have. The negative voxels but the reason I have this massive cave inside a mountain is so I can do this. So if you have like an open space selected, you can heal it up, and these are basically voxels that the world's already pre-generated. Now at its most basic level, what it allows you to do haha, did I still have that selected over there? Derp. Shouldn't do it on part of the floor where I've actually had voxel strings already. Hang on. I don't think I came this far down. Let's see. Yeah, it should be fine then. That, by the way, is where you have to remember where you've actually had stuff placed at some point. So, the way that the sort of world voxels interact with normal voxels that you place I've got this dead simple square shape here. It's nothing fancy. If you were going to make it normally, the game recognises that there's a space in that shape. So you can see the difference. Essentially what happened there between the two types is that on your normal sort of style shape, if you were just going to make a bog standard shape of whatever you wanted really, when you apply that shape to something, it will pretty much just delete what you have. So you can kind of see that, like my little line I had here, it's deleted the voxel that would have been here. However, with this, it's effectively where it will recognise it as what they class as negative voxels. So they're there in the fact that they're part of the world, but they don't interact with the voxels you place down. So as a result, although it's exactly the same shape, when you copy it and then paste it on, it more or less just gets rid of all your air. Make sense?